If you're new to painting with watercolour, I'm going to show you a few techniques that I use to bring my paintings to life. Hi everyone, I painted this hydrangea last week and I thought I'd use it today to give you a closer look at some of the techniques that I use in just about all of my watercolour paintings. If you want to paint the whole painting with me, step by step, I've put a tutorial on Patreon where you'll have access to the line drawing, the reference photo and the finished painting. The link is in the description. Okay, so the first technique that I want to show you is how I like to mix my colours on the paper rather than on the palette. Now I do this in most of my paintings, so it's a good technique to learn. Dropping one damp colour into another damp colour is an expressive way of mixing colours, and you never really know what it will look like until it dries. And for me, that's one of the techniques that makes painting in watercolour so exciting. So let me show you how I do it. You can mix colours like this over the entire surface of the damp paper if you were doing, say, a sky or something like that. But you can also do this on a small section of a painting, such as a feather on a bird or a petal on a flower. So I just paint the first colour on. I can do this on dry paper or damp paper, it doesn't matter. And then before that paint dries, I'll just drop another colour into it, just while the paint's damp. So that was permanent rose that I used first, and now I'm just dropping some ultramarine violet onto the damp permanent rose. Okay, so now I'll show you how I use this technique when I painted this hydrangea. I use this technique of dropping one colour onto another colour so that the colours will mix on the paper right from the very start. So the very first time I put paint on my paper here for the hydrangea, I'm going to do this. So this is the initial wash. At the moment I've dampened this particular petal that I'm working on and I'm painting it with some watery ultramarine violet. Now before this violet dries, I'm going to drop some blue onto there, some Winsor blue. So here I've just got a damp brush and I'm just taking the paint that's on the paper out to the edge, just because I want a lighter edge. And then before that dries, I'm going to drop some Winsor blue there. So I pick the watery Winsor blue up with my brush, and then I drop it onto the damp paper there and on top of the purple that I've just put there. And because the paper's damp, the two colours just blend together. So here I'm painting some other petals the same way. I paint the watery ultramarine violet over the top. I can do this on either damp paper or I can do it on the dry paper, it doesn't matter. Now I'm picking up some watery permanent rose. And before that purple has dried, I just drop the pink on there. And the two colours just blend together. So here on this outer petal, I've just painted the ultramarine violet on. Now I'm dropping the permanent rose on, and some of the Winsor blue as well. So I've got the three colours on there. Now I'm just going to spread that blue out just with my damp brush. The second technique I want to show you is how to soften paint edges. In a previous video here on YouTube, I talk about watercolour's hard and soft edges. So head there if you're not sure what they are. So basically, if you paint on damp or wet paper, you're going to get soft paint edges. Whereas if you paint on dry paper, the edges of your paint will be hard. Let me show you. So if you just paint a mark on the dry paper you're going to get hard edges all the way around the edge of the mark that you've made. So these edges all the way around the shapes are all hard. So to get a soft edge on a shape or a mark, I wet the paper first. So I just paint some water on. And when it's nice and wet, I pick up some paint and I drop the paint onto the damp paper. And that gives me those lovely soft organic edges around the outside edge. So as long as your paint remains within the edges of the water, so the water is out here and the paint is inside that area, I get those lovely organic shapes around the edge. And a successful painting is made up of soft edges and hard edges, so a combination of both. So when you're painting on damp or wet paper, you have less control of the paint than when you're painting on dry paper. But sometimes when you're painting, you want to have both control and soft edges. So how do you do that? Let me show you. So you can lay a mark down on the dry paper and then you can soften the edge of it with a damp brush. So I'm just painting on the dry paper here, just washing the paint out of my brush, taking the excess moisture off, and then I rub that damp brush along the edge of the mark that I've just made. And that just softens that hard edge there. Sometimes when I'm painting, I'll have two brushes in my hand. I'll put the paint on with one brush and I'll soften the paint with the other. And there are two things to remember when you soften paint edges this way. The first is that you want your brush to be damp, not sopping wet. And you don't want it to be too dry either. I'll show you what I mean. So I'll just show you the right way again. I'll just make a mark on the dry paper. And then I wash out the brush and I just give it a quick dab just to get rid of the excess. And then I use it to soften the edge. Now I'll do it with too much water on my brush this time. I'll pick up the paint, I'll make a mark, I'll wash the paint out of my brush, but I won't dab the brush on a towel. I'll just put it straight onto the paint to try and soften the edge. And what happens is you put too much water on the paper and then the paint that was there just rushes into that new lot of water. You just end up making a mess. And the other problem you might find is you've made a mark and you want to soften it, but you take too much moisture out of your brush and you make your brush too dry. So I wash the paint out of my brush and then I dab it on my towel, but I'm just dabbing a bit too much. I'm taking too much of the moisture out. And then when I go to soften the edge, my brush isn't damp enough. And then I have to struggle to try and soften the edge of the paint. So the best way to do it is to just have a slightly damp brush. It takes a bit of practice, but eventually you'll do it without thinking about it. The second thing to remember is that you have to do it straight away. You can't allow the paint that you've just laid down on the paper to dry because you won't be able to soften the edge then. So that's why sometimes I'll paint with two brushes, one to put the paint on and one that's damp and ready to soften the paint edge. Okay, so let me show you how I use this technique when I painted the hydrangea. Okay, so here I'm adding some detail to this petal. I'm painting some Winsor blue just onto the dry paper, just between some veins. And now I take my damp brush and I soften the edge of the paint. So I'll show you again. I put the paint on with one brush, just on the dry paper. And then I take my damp brush and I soften the edge. So over here I'm doing the same thing. I put the paint on the dry paper. And then because I want a soft edge, I just take a damp brush and then I just rub over the paint softly with it. So I put the paint on the dry paper. So I've got lots of control where I'm putting it. And then I just soften the edge away with my damp brush. And while that's damp, I can drop some colour on, just to change the colour. So here, I put the paint on where I want it. I've got control because the paper's dry, but because I don't really want hard edges here, I just take my damp brush and then I just rub it over the edges that I want to be soft. And I do this all the way through the painting, even at the very last stages. So I put the paint on the dry paper here. Got lots of control because the paper's dry. And then because I don't want a hard edge where the dark purple paint finishes and the light purple paint starts, I just take a damp brush and I just soften the edge away. The third technique I want to show you is glazing one colour over the top of another. And doing this just deepens and modifies the colour. So let me show you. So I'll just paint some of the ultramarine violet just on the dry paper. Now I have to give that time to dry before I can paint another layer of paint over the top. So it's dry now, and now I'm just painting a layer of the permanent rose over the top. Now if I wanted a soft edge there, I could take my damp brush now and just wipe away that hard edge through the middle. Now I have to let that dry, and I can paint yet another layer over the top of that. So if you want to modify your colours, make them darker, change them all together, just layer watery washes of the paint over the top of one another. So this is the Windsor blue now that I'm just painting on the top. So now I'll show you how I put this glazing technique to use in my hydrangea painting. Okay, so here on this petal I've got some white veins that I just want to cover over. So I'm just painting a watery wash of the permanent rose over the top of the dry violet. So the layer of violet that I painted first is nice and dry now. I'm not disturbing it. But I just wanted those veins that are on the petals to be pink. So I've just washed the pink there, and now I'm just softening the edge where the pink finishes. So I put it on, and then I take a damp brush and I soften the edge away. So that's all dry now, and I'm going to start to add detail over the top of the pink wash. So I've got the violet again now. Just painting it between the veins. And what I want to do is soften the edge again. So I get my damp brush and I wipe away that edge. So remember this one over here that I painted earlier? Now I want to change the colour of it. So I'm just washing some watery pink over the top. I've actually dampened the paper here, but all the purple work that I did was dry. So I dampened it with some water and then I put the pink wash over the top. I'm doing the same thing down here on this petal. I just want to change the colour slightly and I want to make it darker. So I'm just glazing some watery paint over the top. So this just alters the colour slightly and it deepens it, makes it darker. And I did this all over the hydrangea painting. I deepened the colour, I changed the colour just by painting those transparent washes over the top of one another. So here on this petal I'm going to combine all three of those techniques. Here I'm glazing one colour over the top of another colour. Now I'm taking my damp brush and I'm softening the edge of the paint. And now I'm going to drop another colour onto that damp paint just to change it again. So I glaze the darker colour over the top of the lighter colour, just on the dry paper. And then I can drop in a new colour while that paint is still damp. And then I just take my damp brush to soften the edge. So there's three techniques that I use in just about all of my watercolour paintings. So number one, mixing colours on the paper. Number two, softening edges. And number three, glazing colours. Learn how to do them properly and you'll be on your way to improving your paintings. As I said at the start of the video, you can watch how I painted this hydrangea step by step on Patreon. Don't forget to like this video and hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next week with a new tutorial.